During our wedding speech, my wife told everyone that she loved my brother. So, I called off the wedding and canceled our honeymoon plans. Now, she and her family are mad at me. I want to begin by saying that my older brother, Greg, has been my best friend for as long as I can remember. Growing up, he wasn't just a sibling, he was my guide, my protector, and my constant companion. From a young age, Greg took me under his wing, teaching me so many things that shaped who I am today. One of my earliest memories is Greg teaching me how to ride a bike around the neighborhood. I was a shy kid, more cautious and hesitant, but Greg was patient. He ran alongside the bike, holding the seat steady until I was ready to balance on my own. I'll never forget the moment I finally got it right. Greg was there, cheering me on, just as proud as I was. That's just the kind of brother he was, always there to encourage and support me, pushing me to try new things and never letting me feel alone. In school, I struggled a bit with my shyness. Making friends didn't come naturally to me, but Greg was always there to bridge the gap. He introduced me to his friends, made sure I was included, and helped me navigate those early social situations that felt so overwhelming at the time. Because of him, I never felt out of place, and slowly but surely, I started to come out of my shell. Our bond was further strengthened by the countless hours we spent together after school. Every evening, you could find us in the neighborhood playing games, riding our bikes, or just exploring the world around us. Those were the best times, just the two of us, having fun and enjoying each other's company. What stands out to me the most is how we hardly ever fought. Sure, we had our moments like any siblings do, but they were rare and never lasted long. Out of the two of us, Greg has always been the more good-looking one, something I noticed early on. He naturally attracted attention from girls no matter where he went. This never seemed to bother him, in fact, he quite enjoyed it. Over the years, I watched as he broke quite a few hearts along the way. But everything changed when he met Stephanie, my ex-sister-in-law. From the moment they met, it was clear that this time Greg had fallen hard. It was different from his previous flings. This was real, deep love. It didn't take long for them to get married and start a family. I could see how happy Stephanie made him, and honestly, it made me happy too. She wasn't just his wife, she became like a sister to me. We clicked right away, and I quickly came to love her as part of our family. The three of us, Greg, Stephanie, and I, formed a close-knit group, spending countless hours together. Whether it was having drinks, throwing parties, or just hanging out, we always had a great time. Stephanie fit right in, and I couldn't have been more thrilled to have her in our lives. Then, when I met my wife, who was at the time my girlfriend, Chloe, I was eager to bring her into the fold. I wanted her to experience the same sense of belonging and camaraderie that I had with Greg and Stephanie. Luckily, Chloe and Stephanie hit it off immediately. They became fast friends, and it was such a relief to see how well they got along. Greg and I were both over the moon about it. Our little group had grown, and now it felt even more complete. Looking back, I never saw any issues within our group. To me, everything seemed perfect. We were all close, supportive of one another, and genuinely happy. Maybe I was too caught up in the joy of it all, but I never noticed any red flags. It's possible I was too focused on the good times we were having to see anything else. That's why, when Stephanie called me in tears one day while I was at work, asking to meet up with me, I knew something was seriously wrong. The urgency in her voice and the fact that she specifically asked me not to tell Greg made me even more concerned. I agreed to meet her without hesitation, knowing that whatever it was, it must have been something big. We met at a small cafe near my office. I walked in and saw Stephanie sitting there, looking miserable. Her face was puffy and red, like she had been crying all night. My heart sank. I immediately went over, gave her a hug, and asked her what was going on, trying to prepare myself for whatever she was about to tell me. That's when she broke down completely, barely able to get the words out as she confessed that she had caught my brother, Greg, talking to another woman, apparently his coworker. I was stunned. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was saying. Stephanie explained that she had found them exchanging inappropriate pictures and even, "I love you," messages. Twice. I was in disbelief. I had genuinely thought Greg had turned over a new leaf after meeting Stephanie, that he was committed to his family and had left his old ways behind. This revelation felt like a punch to the gut. As she spoke, I could see the pain in her eyes, and I knew this wasn't just some misunderstanding. Stephanie showed me the screenshots, and as much as I didn't want to believe it, there it was, clear as day. My brother, who I thought had changed, was back to his old ways, risking everything for an affair with his coworker. The pictures they had exchanged were so inappropriate that I felt ashamed on behalf of my brother. I asked Stephanie what she planned to do next and whether she had confronted Greg about what she had found. She shook her head, explaining that she hadn't said anything to him yet. Instead, she had made up her mind to quietly move out with their child and go to her parents' place before letting Greg know about the affair. Her voice trembled as she told me this, and I could see the fear in her eyes. She was scared of how Greg might react when he found out she knew. I tried to reassure her, telling her that Greg would never lay a finger on her, but she countered by saying that she thought she knew Greg too, and clearly, he wasn't the person she believed him to be. So, she didn't want to take any risks with him. That hit me hard. I understood her fear and reasoning. If he could betray her like this, what else might he be capable of? It wasn't just about the affair, it was about trust, or rather, the complete shattering of it. Seeing her so vulnerable, I told her that if she needed anything at all, she could call me, and I would be there to help. She nodded, still clearly shaken, and I hoped my offer of support gave her some small sense of comfort in the midst of the chaos her life had suddenly become. Then, as if everything Stephanie had already told me wasn't bad enough, she hesitated for a moment, looking as though she was weighing whether or not to say more. Finally, she took a deep breath and told me there was something else I needed to know. Her eyes avoided mine as she spoke, and I could feel a sense of dread creeping over me again. What could possibly be worse than what I had just heard? Stephanie then told me that she had come across some very alarming messages exchanged between Greg and my girlfriend, Chloe, as well. My mind struggled to process what she was saying. I frowned in confusion, not quite able to believe what I was hearing. But then she showed me the screenshots, and my confusion only deepened as I looked at the evidence right in front of me. The messages between Greg and Chloe were frequent, far more so than I had ever imagined. They seemed to be talking almost daily, which was odd, to say the least. Stephanie, trying to be sensitive, pointed out that she didn't want to overstep her bounds by speaking about my relationship, but she couldn't help but notice that, despite how close she and I were, we didn't communicate nearly as often as my girlfriend and my brother did. I stared at the messages, feeling a mixture of disbelief and a growing sense of unease. I saw Chloe sending Greg various funny videos, photos of dogs, sunsets, and other random things. On the surface, these seemed harmless enough, but what troubled me was the fact that Chloe never sent me those kinds of messages. It was strange, and I couldn't help but wonder why she was sharing these moments with Greg instead of with me. Stephanie emphasized that this exchange might be completely innocent, but given what she had just learned about Greg's infidelity, she felt it was only right to bring this to my attention. She didn't want me to end up blindsided the way she had been, and I could tell she was genuinely concerned for me. I could see where she was coming from, and as much as I wanted to believe there was a perfectly reasonable explanation for the messages, I couldn't ignore the pit in my stomach. I thanked Stephanie for telling me, knowing how difficult it must have been for her to bring this up. I assured her that I would definitely talk to Chloe about it and get to the bottom of what was going on. As I left the cafe, my mind was racing. I couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal, not just for Stephanie, but for myself as well. What if there was more to this? What if Greg wasn't just betraying Stephanie, but me too? I needed answers, and I knew the only way to get them was to confront Chloe and find out the truth. When I finally gathered the courage to confront Chloe about what Stephanie had told me, I approached the conversation as gently as I could. But as soon as I brought it up, her reaction was immediate and intense. She seemed almost offended that I would even think to question her about it. She called the whole thing ridiculous, and before I could even get another word in, she shoved her phone into my hands, telling me I could go through it if I really wanted to. The situation quickly escalated, and I found myself trying to calm her down, reassuring her that I did trust her. My intention wasn't to accuse her but simply to understand why she was sharing these videos and photos with Greg and not with me. But instead of addressing my concerns, Chloe flipped the narrative. She argued that I never appreciated things like she did, and that she and Greg had more in common when it came to those interests. Hence, she would text him about it. She went on to assure me that she saw Greg as a big brother, just like I did, and insisted she would never cross any lines. The way she put it all sounded so reasonable, and in the heat of the moment, I started to feel guilty for even bringing it up. The last thing I wanted was to seem like I didn't trust her or that I was being paranoid. So, I ended up apologizing to her instead, feeling bad for having doubted her in the first place. But now, looking back on that conversation, I realize Chloe was probably gaslighting me the entire time. I wish I hadn't let her talk me out of my instincts. I should have seen the red flags for what they were, but instead, I let myself be convinced I was overreacting. If I had trusted my gut, maybe things would have turned out differently. Long story short, Greg and Stephanie's marriage ended in a nasty divorce. Despite the overwhelming evidence Stephanie had of his infidelity, Greg refused to admit any guilt. Instead of owning up to his mistakes, he lashed out, deflecting the blame entirely. He started telling anyone who would listen that Stephanie was just a gold digger who had married him for his looks and money, rather than acknowledging that he had destroyed their relationship. Whenever I tried to bring up the topic of why he had cheated in the first place, Greg would shut me down immediately. He would get angry and dismissive, telling me that being married to the same person for years was boring and that I'd understand one day if I ever went through it myself. It was frustrating and disheartening to hear him talk like this about Stephanie. During the divorce proceedings, Greg lost almost half of his assets to Stephanie and was also ordered to pay child support. This only fueled his bitterness, and he spiraled further into his self-destructive habits. As a result, his behavior became even more erratic. He started drinking heavily, and most nights, he would show up at my house completely blacked out from alcohol, only to crash on my couch. He would often tell me how much he hated sleeping alone in that big house, the same house that once felt like a home when he was with Stephanie and their child. Now, it was just a hollow reminder of everything he had lost due to his own foolishness. I wanted to help Greg see the truth, to encourage him to take responsibility, but he was too deep in his own bitterness and regret to listen. All I could do was continue to be there for him, even as I watched him struggle with the fallout of his decisions. The divorce really changed Greg in ways I never could have anticipated. He was never the same after that. His behavior became increasingly reckless and self-destructive. He started sleeping around more, skipping work, and openly ogling women in public without any shame. What really began to bother me, though, was when he would almost unconsciously flirt with my girlfriend, Chloe, right in front of me. At first, I tried to brush it off. Greg had always been a bit of a flirt, and I convinced myself this was just a phase he was going through as he dealt with the fallout from his divorce. But the more I observed, the more I noticed how Chloe would blush during their conversations, giggling like a schoolgirl whenever Greg made a comment or joke. I knew my brother well, and I was absolutely certain he would never cross the line with my girlfriend. That was something I felt I could trust him on completely. However, I couldn't shake the feeling that Chloe's reactions to him were more than just friendly. She seemed almost giddy around him, and it started to gnaw at me. I decided I couldn't sit on these feelings any longer, so I had another conversation with Chloe. This time, I was more direct. I told her that if she continued to behave inappropriately around Greg, I would have no choice but to break up with her. I made it clear that my brother would never betray me, so if there was going to be a problem, it would be between her and me. I wasn't going to let her actions create a rift between Greg and me. My words seemed to scare her, and she immediately apologized. She told me she had never realized her behavior around Greg was inappropriate and promised to be more careful in the future. Chloe assured me that she had never meant to make me feel uncomfortable or disrespected, and she seemed genuinely remorseful. At the time, her apology eased my worries somewhat, and I wanted to believe that things would go back to normal. To her credit, after our conversation, Chloe made a noticeable effort to reduce her interactions with Greg. She no longer engaged in one-on-one banter with